So at the very start of this week's parsha, we have kind of what I would call some leftovers from last week. I mean, just to go a little bit further with that same thought, just in terms of the chapter, it's still part of the previous chapter. It's still part of Perek Kafeh. To start a parsha, Perek Kafeh Pasuk Yud. So you realize that there is this sense that we're in the middle of something, but moreover, I mean, even in terms of our tradition, had this next part been part of the previous parsha, I don't believe anybody would have complained and said, hold it a second, what are you doing? Don't you know that Parsha Pinchas should be independent and we should start afterwards? But nonetheless, apparently, whenever the division of the parsha were made and the whole Babylonian rite of dividing the Torah into a years-long amount of parshiot, there was this decision in order to make it this parsha, which we'll call Pinchas, I guess they called Pinchas. And what I'm going to try to do is something you can accuse me a little bit, but it's not too much. Don't overthink it. You can accuse me a little bit of that it's not necessarily organic because the division of the parsha is somewhat human, but that's not the case because it's just like there's one episode after another, after another, after another, and it's that sequence of episodes that we have in this week's parsha, which is what I really want to comment on. So let's begin. This leftover part, what it identifies is that Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen, he acted, you want to use the word vengeance? You want to use the word zealot? I guess, depending on your political sensibilities will depend on how much you want to identify Pinchas as being really bad. On the other hand, if you really like Pinchas, I know a couple of people. I mean, recently there was somebody had an aliyah and he was called up in my shul, and his name was Pinchas Eliyahu. So I said, why did your father choose this? And he said, or mother, and he said, oh, they wanted to make sure that I'm like a complete zealot. And so Pinchas. On the other hand, if you feel that Pinchas was actually a moderate response, then that says a lot about you as well. So I guess that this is a good way of trying to define people's sensibilities. And as usual, I'll just comment in passing not to look at the Mei Shiloach because it is the most bizarre commentary on this episode. I mean, his whole commentary is bizarre. The Ishbitzer. I mean, Ishbitzer. I'll go so far as saying that any teacher who quotes the Ishbitzer, I know lots of nice people do it, I would find them suspect in terms of everything about them. So I know that maybe sounds very strong. But he actually writes that Zimri was right and Pinchas was wrong. So if you can come to the conclusion that Zimri is right and Pinchas is wrong, then as far as I'm concerned, there's something very wrong. Because that's going to take you down the path that you can justify anything and everything and anything and everything multiplied. So we'll just leave it at that. Good? Good. I mean, some of the strands of Ishbitz ends up in Rav Tzadok. We're not talking about Hasidus today, and as I said, somewhat suspect. Let's continue. And at the end, we're told the name of the perpetrators, which is also interesting, because last week there were these nameless people, and they turned out to be Zimri and Cosby, and we'll end that. Source number 2 begins, "V'yihi acharei ha'magefa," and that is both a beginning and an end. It's a pasuk b'toch pasuk. It is both the introduction and it's the conclusion, but it serves as really interesting linkage because something significant happened. 24,000 people died. And now it's saying, and afterwards, which is essentially telling us what's about to happen next, is somehow connected to what happened before. And therefore, when I said from the beginning that I'm looking for the connections between the various parts of the Parsha, I want all of us just to note for the moment that those 3 words accomplish that. It's saying that there is some kind of continuity, there's some kind of a linkage, and what we're about to read, we need to realize is connected to what we just now read, even though it may not be that simple. And that's part of what I want to get back to before we finish today. And it says, "Vayom Hashem Moshe Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen lemor." Now, there's something interesting about that as well, is that we're so used to Vayom Hashem Moshe Aaron, so now Aaron's been replaced. So Aaron has been replaced, and his son Elazar. I'm going to use a word, and the reason I'm going to use this word is because this word is going to come up again and again and again in this week's parsha. That Elazar has by now inherited the position of his father, and now it's V'yamashah Moshe ve'el Elazar ben Aaron. Seurosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael miben esrim shana v'mal u'beit avotam kol yotzei tzava b'Yisrael. Go, we're going to have a census of all the people going out to fight. And if I didn't know better, then I would think right now, okay, we're moving towards the end of the book of Bamidbar. We're moving towards the conquest, which really has already begun. And therefore, we need to clarify in terms of the soldiers and going out and so on and so forth, which, by the way, has happened already. But then again, there was just a Magefa. So after the Magefa, maybe you want to know how many people have survived. And all of that makes perfect sense, except what it says as what the stated purpose is as we continue. And that is at the end of Pasuk Nun Aleph, Eile B'Kudei, gives us the number, and then Pasuk Nun Bet. V'Yidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor, La'ele, now what is La'ele? La'ele are the people that we just now counted. La'ele, to these, Tichalek Ha'aretz B'Nachala. These are the people who are going to receive the inheritance, who are going to receive their parts of the land of Israel. Which means, when I said before that this word inheritance, which I have placed in, is more important than we're noting, here you see it already, that the Nachala is already going to be divided. La'ele techalek ha'aretz b'nachala b'mispar shemot. L'rav tarben nachalato u'le'ma'at tam'it nachalato ish lefi pukodav yutan nachalato. So you now realize that there is a word which is being used again and again. And what is that word? That word is nachala, nachalato, inheritance. And now you realize again, in retrospect, that this counting of the people was not just simply in order to get an army ready and to get people ready to go to war. There was an objective to the war. The objective of the war is to capture the land, but it's not just capturing the land. This is really about 2 steps past that. And that is the division of the land and the inheritance of the land. And it's as if that the other issues are almost an afterthought, but this is really what the focus is. And it goes on to say, Af b'goral yechalek et haaretz l'shmot matot, and so on. Avotam yinachalu, if you needed the word again. Al pi hagoral techalek nachalato, bein rav lima'at. So how many times did you need the word nachala to be mentioned over here till you realize that that's what is taking place, at least in this section, as the major issue? That then should lead us directly, even though I have a couple of verses I skipped, and it says, just one second. Right. Moshe ve'Elazar HaKohen, going back to this point of Moshe and Elazar, Shepakdu b'nei Yisrael b'arvot Moav l'den Yericho. And by the way, keep in mind Yericho. Yericho, right? Let's keep that in mind as well. Right? Have that go in your head someplace. Uve'ela lo haya ish mipkudei Moshe ve'Aaron HaKohen. Shepakdu b'nei Yisrael midar Sinai, ki amar Shem lehem mot. So the whole generation is gone. The only people here left are Kalev and Yoshua, and that's going to have a significance in terms of us moving forward. Next section, new chapter, source number 3. Vatek Ravana, did I read that right? Vatik Ravna, Benot Slavchad. So I'll actually read their names. Machla, Noah, V'chagla, Umilka, V'tirtza. My grandmother was Bela Machla. She was named after one of the Benot Slavchad. I have a niece whose name is Shani, and everyone knows her as Shani. And by her chuppah, when they read the Ketuvah, they read her proper name, Shena Bela Machla. There was a gasp. It's like all the people who knew her for so many years had no idea that her name was not just Shani. It was Shani Bela Machla. My daughter just got the Bela reworked a little bit. She became Elisheva, which somehow morphed from Isabella, which is part of the Bela, and so on. She didn't get the Machla. Vata'amodna l'fnei Moshe l'fnei Elazar Kohen. Okay, so now Moshe and Elazar instead of Aaron, and so on. And we are well aware of their complaint. Our father has passed away. He was not part of the sinners with Korach, and he died without sons. And they say, Tna lanu achuzah. Now they use the word achuzah, How would you want to translate achuzah? Well, you guys had no help today. What? I think it's a homestead or something. Achuzah. Give us an achuzah betoch achei avinu. And Moshe goes and questions and asks God. Vayom Hashem Moshe lemor, Kain benot slavcha dovrot, naton titelam achuzat. What's the next word? Nachala. So do you now realize again that the word nachala is again this major theme which has been going through, and it continues, and now the word nachala will be used multiple times moving through. B'toch achei avihim vevarta et nachalat avihim lahem. And so on, so just like we saw previously that the word nachala was being used again and again, so now you realize that the Benot Slavcha continues along the same theme. Yes, there's somewhat of a twist over here, something which was not obvious. They go and they question regarding this idea of dividing the land and giving people their rightful home, or inheritance, and they insist on receiving their inheritance as well, and God agrees. Now, that then leads us to the next section. The next section is with pasuk, and just in case, we also have the word v'yarash ota, and so on, which again, nachala, inheritance, is all clear. Pasuk Yud Bet. V'yomer Hashem o Moshe, alei al har avrim hazeh, וראה את הארץ אשר נתתי לבני ישראל, וראית אותה ונספת אל עמך גם אתה, כאשר נסף אהרון אחיך. So, as we previously noted, that Aaron was replaced by Eleazar, now we're being told that Moshe is going to need a replacement as well. Where did I get that from? Well, I hope that's really obvious, because God just now, within this context of Nachala, is now telling him, go take a good look at the land, because that's as close as you're getting. And then we have Pasuk Tedvav, which is a Pasuk which is so familiar but not, because there's an ever so slight twist, and what is it? Vaydiber Moshe el Hashem lemar, right? We're used to the inverse, right? Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemar, and this one is Vaydaber Moshe el Hashem lemar. Yivkod Hashem elokei ruchot l'kol basar ish aleida. And Moshe then responds and says, well, if I'm going to die, then there needs to be a leader. We can't leave a people without a leader. There needs to be inheritance, right? There needs to be a person who's going to take over. Asher yitzei lifneim, asher yavo lifneim, v'lo tiyeh adat Hashem kitzona she'en lahem raya. Now we had a little bit of foreshadowing a couple of verses before this when we were told, oh yeah, by the way, Kalev and Yeshua are still around. There are some people of substance that maybe we could call upon. And now, lo and behold, Yeshua comes. And again, we know that Yeshua had been selected a long time before this already with the war against Amalek. He was already there leading, and there was already this message then that he's going to continue the battles and continue the fighting and so on. Pasuk Kaf Aleph, Lufnei Elazar Kohen Yamod, v'sha'al lo b'mishpat ha'urim lufnei Hashem. And therefore, just to complete this sense of Moshe and Aaron being replaced, you now have, being said really clearly, you're going to have Yoshua and Elazar, and he's going to then, we'll have this division of leadership. Moshe is being replaced by Yoshua. And it's interesting because Moshe is everything. I mean, Moshe was a king. Moshe was a religious leader. Moshe is a political leader. Moshe also served as a Kohen Gadol. I mean, at some point, if you paid attention, you would see that as well. But over here, it very much sounds like, no, there's going to be division here. And Yeshua is going to then, he will turn to Elazar, v'sha'alo b'mishpat ha'urim lifnei Hashem. Al piv yetzu v'al piv yavo hu v'chol b'nei Yisrael ito v'chol eda. So Moshe had asked for someone who can then be the one who will lead, and they will go out and go forward and stop based upon that person. And what God is telling Moshe is actually going to be a combination of this leadership of Yehoshua and of Elazar. Vayas Moshe kasher tziva Hashem oto v'yikach et Yehoshua v'yamideu lifnei Elazar kohen ulifnei kol ha'eda v'yismoch et yadav alav v'yitzaveu kasher diber Hashem biyad Moshe. So till this point, have we gotten the sense that what the parsha is doing is talking about this idea of continuity and this idea of inheritance, and that seems to be really going through from, again, almost the beginning, because we don't really understand the beginning yet, and going through the various sections afterwards leading up to source number 4. And it's source number 4 which is going to cause all the commentaries to become perplexed. And it says, Vaydeber Hashem, again, new chapter, Perek Kafchet. Vaydeber Hashem Moshe Leim, Vatzav b'nei Yisrael, Marti Lahim et Korbani Lachmi Lishai, Reich Nichok Tishmu Lakriv Li B'Ma'odo. V'Marti Lahem Zeh Ishe, Asher Tikriv V'lo Kvasim b'nei Shanat Yimim Shanayim Layom Ala Tamid, Et HaKeves Achat Taseh B'Boker, V'Keves Hashanit Taseh B'En Abayim, and so on. And what we're going to be introduced now is the various Korbanot Tzibur that are going to be brought on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, in terms of all the holidays, and we're going to have this whole list of korbanot to be brought. And once again, if you want to play the same game, we could have asked, and if this whole section was placed somewhere in the book of Vayikra, okay, anywhere in the book of Vayikra, no one would have had a problem, and no one would have said, hold it a second, why didn't you put that at the end of Pinchas where it belongs to be? Because it does not seem at first glance to be logically connected to everything that we've read till now. I'm skipping Rashi. I don't know if you know this, I like to start with Onkelos and with Rashi and try to go from simple to, or supposed simple, to more complex. I found Rashi complex and I decided to skip it. It would have required to go into Rashi and all the commentaries on Rashi, and instead we're going straight to the Ramban, and I hope that's okay with you. And the Ramban writes, V'ta'am, now when he says V'ta'am, what do you now realize? V'ta'am tzavet b'nei Yisrael alehem et korbani lachmi, which means then the reason, right? Which means, what is he telling you right now? Is we need a reason, and it's something requires explanation. Ki acharesh amar la'ela techalei haaretz. So what did the Ramban just now do? He's connecting it to the previous section, and once we got to this point of nachalan, dividing the land, tziva lahashlim torata karbanot sheyasu kein ba'aretz. God said, oh, now we have to go and finish up all the other laws about living in the land. Because these offerings were not brought in the land. We'll skip a little bit. And these people entering land have to do everything. And even though it didn't say that, and I'm just going to stop here. You realize that the Ramban himself knows that there's a little bit of a difficulty, which he's going to try to smooth over. And if I can pick on all of you for a second, do you find this interpretation convincing or not necessarily? Or maybe you did until I asked the question.
I did.
What?
To me, it was convincing.
So you fell for it. Okay. So, what? You're satisfied? That's a large. It's a larger issue, but apparently they didn't do certain types of korbanos. So, one second. Can we try to do this statistically now? Can you go and search for me in the rest of the Torah from here through the end of Devarim? How many more mitzvot there will be presented to us, which are unique mitzvot, which have to be done in the land of Israel, which have not been mentioned yet? And do you want me to give you an example? Minoi melech. Okay, you want me to give you shoftim v'shotrim? You want me to keep on going? There's a whole bunch of laws which are going to apply. There's a whole bunch of laws which I said 1 second. I said those that weren't mentioned. I said those that weren't mentioned yet. Okay, so if I'm going to say, hold it a second, they're about to go to the land, and the laws that weren't mentioned, so we need to put this here. So, do you realize you still now have to ask? So why is this here? Yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I ruined it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I ruined it for you. You were happy, and so on. At least I didn't accuse you of being intellectually lazy like I normally do with my students. It's like ask any question, give any answer. Okay, we're good now. Let's go on, and then will it be on the test? So. So I'm going to say it again. To do this seriously, you really you really need to go and take a list of what yeah, and it doesn't. I'm just going to say the answer is good. Look at Rabbeinu Bachai in source number 6. And by the way, Rabbeinu Bachai, again, I'm not going to give you statistics. He's someplace between 70 to 80% telling you what the Ramban says. That's just generally what he does. And in this case, he doesn't. Although you'll see he's coming from the same place. Et Korbani Lachmi, Nismachar Parshat Korbanot Lakan. So just stop for a second. What is he doing? What is he telling you? That we need to figure out why this is here. So I'm going to say this again just to make sure we understand this. Bamidbar is primarily a book of narrative. It's a book of narrative which possesses within it various laws. When a law is put in a particular place, you need to ask this question. What is the question? Why is this law in this particular place? So therefore he says, Nismachar Parshat Korbanot Lakan, Lefi Shekfar Nitztava Moshe Sheyazhir Yisrael HaKorbanot Shehem Chayavim Lasot, Va'achshav Kishira'a Shelo Yikanes Imam La'aretz Hodiyam Inyan HaKorbanot. That now when Moshe's told that he's not going in, so now he said, I better tell them the rest of the stuff about Korbanot. Now, it's very similar, but it's different. If you need to... Yeah, so Moshe has all these things to teach, all these things he was told, and you know what? It's like the teacher figures I'm going to have all the time in the world to teach everything I need to teach. And then one day you realize you don't have all the time that you thought that you have, and now, that little clock with the sand in it has been turned over, and the sand is falling out of it, and Moshe's realizing that there's not so much time left. So it's interesting because the way that the Ramban presented it is, this just follows, let me put it this way. The Rabbeinu B'chaye, there's so much more pathos involved in it. If you want, I can overstate this because that's what briskers like to do and say that is a din in the chefta and this is a din in the gavra. That had to do with the korbanot themselves, and this has to do with Moshe. I mean, in Gavra, it's Moshe. That Moshe realizes that he's just not going to be there till this. It's not even till this moment. It's like there was always this hope, and maybe the hope continues through Parshat V'etchanan. There's always this hope that Moshe is going to go with them anyway, and somehow everything's going to work out. Yes? If you're an optimist, everything's going to work out. And if it's going to work out, he's going to end up going to the land. When he gets there, when we get up to this section, I'll teach it. And now suddenly Moshe realizes, I'm not going there, so I better teach them that now. By the way, did that work? Is that better? See what I did? See what I did to you? Now I ruined that. I ruined almost any answer that we're going to try to give. The OUisrael Chaim, Tzavet B'nei Yisrael, Tzorech Ladat, Lama Sider Parshat HaKorbanot B'makom Zeh, Achar Mino Yoshua. Now again, you realize now that everybody who's going to ask this is a good question. They all know the same thing. What is this? You need to ask this question. But look the way that he frames it. But the way you frame the question is also dictates what you may answer. Meaning, one framed it, the Ramban framed it after the land was already divided. The Rabbeinu B'chaye frames it after Moshe was told he's not going in. Or Chaim frames it after Yeshua was told that he is going in. So everybody's framing the question somewhat different, and therefore you're going to end up in a somewhat of a different place. And the answer is less important. You'll take a look if you want to. He thinks it's the definition of the tzibur. L'zeh seder mitzvah zu achar min yeshuv v'tziva ba shetiyeh mishel tzibur ka'amru tzavet b'nei Yisrael lomar she'ena timidim ba'im elam mishel tzibur. I'll just say this, that the entering into the land is going to create a new sense of public. I know that doesn't make sense to you yet, but let's put it this way. One of the talks that I give when or at least that I offer when I go to Chutz La'aretz and people invite me to speak, will be the difference between Judaism as practiced in the land of Israel versus Judaism as practiced in Chutz La'aretz. In Chutz La'aretz, it is by definition a Reshut HaYachid. When I say it's Reshut HaYachid, it's missing all of the expressions of the Reshut HaRabim. Just take the examples I gave you before. One of them is going to be Minoi Shoftim, in a real sense. Minoi Melech. It is this national aspect of it. You want to continue with the Beit HaMikdash, you want to continue with the Avodah, but it's more than that. it's a national entity which then decides priorities. Let's say in terms of tzedakah, in terms of social needs, in terms of what you do with your resources, which means essentially, again, if I want to be cruel, I can say that Judaism as practiced in diaspora is essentially a shtibel, and in a shtibel, the most important thing is having, depends on the shtibel, enough herring, enough scotch if you have the herring already. It's the scotch which enables the herring. No one would eat that without it. And maybe if it's a good day, the cholent and so on. But it doesn't think of things in terms of the Reshut Harabim element. So this Orach Chaim is actually really interesting because we're going to cross into the land. We are going to become a nation, not a nation in this sense, meaning I could call the Jews a nation when they're spread about in the diaspora, but it is still nonetheless a different type of an entity. And the challenge of being a country, it's not a simple challenge. It's really not a simple challenge. We've been doing this experiment for a while now. It's not simple, but and I am so much more optimistic about the results of what, despite all the political intrigue which exists. But it is a country which has taken many, many Jewish values and instilled them in terms of its value system, in terms of how we live. But read again the Orach Chaim's response. So again, a korban tzibur has to be something which actually belongs to the tzibur. And what exactly the tzibur is, how do you create a tzibur? It is part of this flip side of entering into the land. So if I just now went too Zionist for some of you, so then I apologize. I'm sure some things that you can do to as an antidote to counter this, but it happens to be true. So just note that. And even if I'm overstating the Orach Chaim, that makes no difference. It happens to be true, and we're going to take a look in a second at Rav Hirsch, and you're going to see to what extent he thinks it's true as well. Yeah. So that's the thing. I knew you were going to ask that. It's a much more of a technical sense, but it's a different type of tzibur which exists. And I know you can say, but what do you mean by that? And I'm not engaging. And 1 second. And that's why it's so interesting that you're saying, oh no, we couldn't bring these korbanot tzibur before. We did not bring them. I mean, that's part of the issue. No, we did not bring those korbanot tzibur in the desert. Why? Now you say, but why not? Why weren't we? Well, obviously something was missing. Okay? So let's look at, yeah, so that's also what's interesting, which means like some of the people who imagine and believe, oh, we can start bringing korbanot today, but it needs to be from the tzibur, and you did the Malchus of the shekel, and how do you go about doing that? I'm just saying that some of these little technical things are so much more complicated. Continue, Rav Hirsch in source number 8. And you'll see that he's going to do the same thing. Beperek HaKodem, right, again, what's he doing? He's looking for the linkage. Beperek HaKodem, Nana Hashem levakash Moshe shedat Hashem lo tisha b'lo manhig. A moment ago, what happened? Moshe pleaded to God that there needs to be also continuity and somebody taking over, and you can't leave people without a leader. Acharei moto, hakarov shel Moshe. Moshe is going to die, and he prays God for someone to inherit that position. Oto manhig yavor lefnei ha'am v'yelo l'mofet b'chayav ha'pratiyim v'tziburim. And that person needs to be exceptional, both in terms of his private and his public life. Uv'hashpato yuchuvan et chay ha'yachid v'tzibur shel ha'am v'yikuyam oto b'maslul shenekval pi Hashem. And that person is therefore going to be able to inspire and to lead the community, the tzibur. Ulam hayatzarech ledog lekach sheyiud zeh shel ha'am. How do you want to translate yiud? It's the objective of the nation. V'shel manhigav, right? The word yiud from the word ad, going towards a place. It's objective, going towards destination. V'shel manhigav lo yasur milibam la'ulam, that we never lose sight of who we are and where we're going. Eli yizkru tamid tafkido hanitzchi sheYisrael v'yachasav el Hashem al pi yichud goralo v'chovato. In terms of what exactly is the role and the destiny of the Jewish people. U'l'shem kach nitzdavu Kahn al korbanot hatzibur hatmimim musafim. And that's the reason, in order to help form and inspire and keep on the right track this collective, we have the offerings of the collective mentioned right here. הלא יבטאו את היחסים האלה ואת הכוונות המתאימות להם בשפה רבת המשמעות של מעשי הקורבנות, ובאמצעות המעשים האלה יביאו אותם לתודעה האומה, נמצא שקורבנות אלה הם השלמה למינוי של יהושע. Is that just like an individual, Yeshua is going to be chosen, he's chosen as the leader of the community, but in order to do that, you need a definition of the community, and the definition of the community is a community that needs consciousness that it serves God, and therefore this consciousness of serving God with the daily offerings and the weekly offerings and the holiday offerings needs to be put. By the way, Rav Hirsch is really good because he can convince you of anything, right? And on top of all that, I believe that this is Rav Breuer's Hebrew. Of course, he wrote in the German, and they say the German is better, and I mean I can't judge at all, but I mean this Hebrew as well is really good. And he says it again in the next line. The parsha of these korbanot is part of the appointment of Yeshua. So what he's saying is that this also has to do with Nachala, but what is the nature of the public aspect of leadership. It always needs to have this consciousness of who we are. We serve God. We are a nation under God. We are a nation who serves God, believes in God, and is always inspired by the mission which God has instilled upon us. And therefore it writes at the end over here, Shekain rak 40 shnot hanisyonot shemidbar natnu lanu toda'a atzmit le'umit. רק בעקבות הניסיונות האלה אנחנו חשים בצורך שיזכירו לנו תמיד את יחסנו אל השם ואת הכוונות שיחסים אלה דורשים מאיתנו. It's at the end of the 40 years in the desert and the failed 40 years in the desert that we now have a sense of how we should be leading our lives. And we need to have God consciousness, and we need to have this on a public level. And therefore, again, what was his framing of it is that not only am I asking, well, why does this follow what's before? This is part of Yeshua's inheriting the role of Moshe, but there's again, and I will to a certain extent tie this with the Orach Chaim, it's that there is this tzibur aspect of it, and as the leader of the tzibur needs to know who they are and what they are, and as I said, all of this works, as far as I'm concerned, wonderfully. If you want to see the Malbim in source number 9, he says, Sav ben Israel, Chazal, and he's the only one of all of them. By the way, don't fall for false negatives, as it were. Just because somebody doesn't quote Chazal doesn't mean that it's not someplace in Chazal. But over here, he was the only one who asks the question and says, oh, Chazal addressed this. Chazal, Pirish Inyan Smichut Parshat Tamid Lahane'emar Lamala, B'bnei Tamid Hazeh Ba Levatel Avodat Hashemesh. It came to counter and serve as an antidote to serving the sun. Shayu mishtachavim va'ovdim et hashemesh pamayim bayom. B'zeroach hashemesh ubein orbayim be'et hashchiyah. So they would bow to the sun when it would rise, and they would bow to the sun when it would set. Avodat haboku poneh lemizrach, avodat ben orbayim poneh lemarav. V'tziv Hashem lakriv lefanav shnei atmidim. V'tiyeh shchitat tamid shel shachar. Those of you who never noticed this before, the last 50 times that you went through the book of Vayikra, that the Tamid Shel Shachar was, the blood was sprinkled, Al Keren Tzfonit Ma'aravit, which is on the opposite side of where the sun rises. V'shel Bein Orbayim Shel Keren Tzfonit Mizrachit, which is the opposite side of where the sun sets. Come on, you didn't know that before you came here. I want any of you to say, sure, I knew that. So you say, wow, that's such an interesting concept. Hafach avodat hashemesh. So he's pointing out how that this tamid, the first korban meeting, twice a day, is actually there as an antidote, as a counter to some of the pagan practices which were done. And by the way, realize something, that in Israel you have a place like Yericho where they serve the moon, and you have a place like Beit Shemesh. What did you think it was? Just the house of the rising sun? Right? Okay. So again, that's Interesting. V'yadua ma shekatav Chazal she'ima Moshe nechnas la'aretz mevatel yitzrad avodah zarah. And everyone knows that Chazal said had Moshe entered, he would have completely destroyed the Yetzer Hara avodah zarah. Lo yatzarich lavodat tamid, and then we wouldn't have needed the tamid. Which means, why is it presented now? Because Moshe's not going in. If Moshe's not going in, then we need this type of an avodah. V'kevan shebikesh she'yivkod Hashem ish alei David ma Yoshua. By the way, it's really interesting. What is the one thing we know about Yeshua? What does he do? He stops the sun. That should be a little more interesting than you realized before. Yes, finally something here. Okay. Shahaya inyano lanhig inyanim v'molchamot u'v'tzrachim v'lo yakocho levatel yitzrad avodah zarah. He didn't have the same capability of actually stopping the Yetzer Hara avodah zarah, and I think that we did enough with this Malbim over here. But I'm going to say this again. I didn't count how many commentaries we just now went through. What is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And they all gave, and I skipped Rashi, and they all gave different interpretations. They all framed it a little differently, but they all asked the same question. Right? They all asked the same question using different words and different ways of seeing it, but they're all troubled by the same point. And what is this doing here? And they all saw it as a continuation of what was here, and therefore it is organically connected to everything else. Which leads me to one problem. And what's my one problem? The very beginning of the parsha. And what's the very beginning of the parsha? It's the part that shouldn't have been there. It's kind of like the leftovers from last week. So let's go last week and see where we are. By the way, neged Hashemish is so much more interesting than you ever would have noted before, right? Just in terms of where we are and what we've done, and it's, learning is always interesting when like two things kind of meet, and then you say, "Oh, I didn't see that before," and if we do this, Vayashov Charon Af Hashem B'Yisrael. If we do this, and by the way, do what? Do what? It means take all the perpetrators, the people who are worshiping Baal, and let's put them on trial. And by the way, put them on trial actually will lead to other things as well. You do realize that. And that will stop the anger, that will stop the problem that we now have. Vayom Moshe El Shoftei Yisrael, Hirgu Ish Anashav and Nitzvadim Lo Pa'ar. And once you put them on trial, what do you do with them? You execute them. Good. And we're not going to translate. Vayar Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. He is mentioned here. I also want to mention that he is not just said his name, but he's ben Elazar and he's ben Aaron HaKohen. I know that this is the old joke, right? Why is Pinchas a Kohen? Because his father was a Kohen and his grandfather was a Kohen. And all of that's quite difficult and complicated at the beginning of our parsha. And this stops the Magefa. And that, by the way, is what's important for us. And what he does is he causes the Magefa to stop, and in the Magefa, 24,000 people were killed. So, I know that I mentioned earlier that he is a zealot, and what other words did we use? He was, what? Fanatic, and therefore we would tend to look down upon him. I just want to, at first, note that there is a Magefa going on, and what action stops the Magefa? It is his action. Let me ask you a simple question. On previous episodes, and yes, preparing for this, I went through every single Magefa that we find prior to this in the Torah. More often than not, we'll just say it like this because it's not exclusive. More often than not, what takes place in order to stop the Magefa? Well, generally there'll be two things. You have Aaron on the one hand and you have Moshe on the other hand, and it's interesting that we don't consider them to be fanatics and so on. And of course you can counter and say, yeah, but they're not killing people. They're doing the opposite, which I understand your sensibility. If you look in Parshat Korach, although that's interesting, because Moshe says, okay, all these people, come, bring the Torah, and let's see what happens, and they all die, and there is a Magefa there as well. And there, we have the God says, I'm going to wipe them out. Not God saying it. He takes it. Not as God said, as Moshe says. He brings about atonement. Do you notice the similarity between that formulation and the one that we had in source 10? Pinchas does what he does, vatatzar hamagefa. Next pasuk, v'yu hametim b'magefa, gives you the number. And here in pasuk Yudalid, v'yu hametim b'magefa, arba asar elef u'shva ma'ot. Right, and then v'magefa netzra. And afterwards, which means, I hope at least you note that there's more similarity here than you would have liked. Yes? Do we note that? But of course, I know you'll tell me, but look at the crucial difference between the two, and I am well aware of this. In Parshat Chukah, you have Moshe putting up the Nachosh Nachoshet, and that then stops what's taking place, and people live. You have in source number 12, this is in Parshat Shlach, where you have it first again, God wants to wipe out everyone, because everyone's complaining. Moshe and Aaron both pray. Kalev and Yeshua get involved as well. Moshe prays again in Pasuk Yud Zayin, Vatayigdana ko Hashem kasher dibarti lemor Hashem erech apayim rav chesed nosei avon fesha. So again, this is Moshe praying. V'nakeh lo yinakeh poged avod avod abanim al shlishim reveim. Slach na lovon ha'am hazeh kol chastech v'sher nasatim la'am hazeh mitzrayim v'adheinam v'yom Hashem salachti k'berecha. By the way, just remember, sooner or later Elul is going to come. Salachti k'berecha is not after the Chet HaEgel. It's not there in Shemot. It's here. But nonetheless, again you have a Magefa, and who survive? Yeshua ben Nun and Kalev survive. So, but who ends up dying instead of all the people? Only the spies end up dying. You want to go back to source 13, Badlotcha, you have there again, Vayach Hashem ba'am makar rabba ma'od. There are a little more intrigue in Balotcha, which if we were learning Balotcha, we would go into. But instead, I want to go back to something else, which I think is the most important precedent or episode that we need to consider in order to understand what's taking place over here. The Chet HaEgel takes place. Moshe comes down from the mountain. Yeshua is there in the background also. Yeshua is interesting because he's in the background. Vayamod Moshe b'shar machaneh vayom mila Hashem elai. Vayasur elav kol b'nei Levi. Vayom elam kol ma Hashem elokei Yisrael. Simu ish charbo al Yericho. Ivru v'shuva mishar l'shar b'machaneh v'ergu ish et achiv v'ish et re'o v'ish et korbo. Vayasur b'nei Levi k'devar Moshe v'yipol min ha'am b'yom hahu k'shloshet alafei ish. Do you realize why I think that this is the closest example to what we had over here in terms of the Baal Peor episode? Because over there we also had God telling Moshe to let's get all the judges out. Everybody should be killing the people in their tribes, which actually means Ishet Achiv. And we have again, I don't want to say exactly, we have a very similar dynamic. Vayom Moshe malu yadchem hayom laHashem ki ish bivno v'achiv l'tet alechem yom bracha. V'yigof Hashem et ha'am. Now, what does that mean? What is the word v'yigof? It's the same word as magefa. That God, what word do you want to use now? He plagued. I don't know. V'yigof Hashem et ha'am al asher asu et ha'egel asher asa Aharon. You know you don't like the ending of that, right? It's so much easier in life when you can blame everything on the Erev Rav, right? Everyone needs an Erev Rav. What happened to your room? It was the Erev Rav, right? Right? What happened to the car? It was the Erev Rav. Again, you could just you could try this. You could try it. I don't know. I don't know if it will work, if it won't work, but it's a plan. Anyway. V'yigof Hashem et ha'am asher asu et ha'egel asher asa Aharon. Now that phraseology, Rashi writes, v'yigof et ha'am mitabidei shamayim. That God went and laid him below Hatra'ah. Right? That mitabidesh, that means that God did this. Ibn Ezra, Yivgof ulai lo ita magaifa b'shana rishona rak sipera katuv mashiach harei nasami arsenai. That yeah, God struck them, but it's not immediate because we don't know what this means. The Bechorsha writes, "Vayigov ha'am et Hashem et ha'am shemetu al piyah dibur mehem shloshet alafim al shasu et egel." No, there's this. Now we can say our theory of conservation of people plagued by the egel, and therefore this goes back to the 3,000, and therefore the 3,000 were struck by God, even though it sounds like perhaps there was some micromanagement, and Levi may have helped out over here as well. Klomar, Aharon chashav latzil etchem min hariga. Now, I'm not even touching that right now, but I'm going to come back soon and explain a little bit more. But go the Rambam writes, Lo siper katuv kama yu ametim b'magefa. Again, he sees this as two different episodes. Kasher siper hanargim biyad b'nei Levi. That we were told 3,000. Kasher piresh b'magefa shel dever korach v'shel bal pa'or. Which means there are all these other cases where we have a magefa, and it tells us what happened over here. It's just that God struck them, and we don't know. But it is interesting because he does compare it with the others, which I told you, of course, is what you need to do. Source number 19, Rabbeinu Yuchas Vayigof Kamovi and Gaf Sheikaro Negev. It is again this magefa, and so on. So let's try all over again. I want to ask you an uncomfortable question. So Aaron is blamed for at least his part in the Egel. Yes? Yes. Do we like blaming Aaron? No, we don't like blaming Aaron. Do we have a choice? Of course we don't have a choice. Later on, we will be told in Devarim that Moshe reveals to us that God was quite upset and wanted to kill Aaron because of what he had done. We just now saw something interesting, that Aaron was trying to do this in a way that the people would be protected, and it doesn't work because the people are going to end up being attacked as well. So now I want to ask you a different question. And my different question is, what was Aaron supposed to do? And I just want to pause as you process a little bit, right? What's he supposed to do? But pause a little bit, because I just want to make things a little bit more parallel. I said that the idea of the Cheta Egel has some kind of similarity to Pa'or, because most of the other things that we saw were complaints and misbehavior. That's Avodah Zarah. And therefore, it's easier for us to define Avodah Zarah and Avodah Zarah. And by the way, somebody really clever is going to be listening and is saying, Pa'or may not be Avodah Zarah. And I'm not going to get into that. Is Pa'or Baal Pa'or when Pa'or is with Baal? Is it Avodah? I'm not getting into that because it doesn't sound good either way. And it sounds like it's really bad. And at least from the Pshat perspective, it sounds like worshipping Baal Pa'or is Avodah Zarah. But there's another element as well, and that is something which Chazal tell us, Rashi identifies, and it says, V'ha'am, that the achlu v'shatu v'kamu l'tzachek. And what does Rashi write by kamu l'tzachek? He says, Gili arayot mashma, which means that he has a combination of different things happening. One is Avodah Zarah, and the other is Gili arayot. Once you have that combination, now I hope that you realize we are that much closer to the Baal Pa'or episode, where you have Gilei Arayot and you have Avodah Zarah as well. So now I'm going to ask you again, and this should not be so difficult, but it is difficult for you. I don't know why. What should Aaron have done?
Kill them, right?
Yeah, you were to say this. I've radicalized you. I made the parallel.
You're saying that that's kind of what maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted.
Okay, asking what a Kadosh Baruch Hu wanted is a kind of fair in a Torah class.
Like he rewarded Pinchas.
So we're getting somewhere now.
And he's punishing them.
So we're getting someplace now. We're getting someplace that you didn't expect to get. Because what did I just now do? Not only am I saying that Pinchas does the right thing, I'm saying Aaron did the wrong thing. But I'm going to say it again. What's Aaron supposed to do when these people want to worship idolatry and they want to break into Gilei Arayot? What should he be doing? He should be pulling out his sword and he should be pulling a Pinchas on them, right? And by the way, if that's not enough, he should be calling all the tribal leaders, like Moshe does over here. Everybody, stop your people. Everybody, stop what's going on over here. Take leadership and let's lay down the law. By the way, let's find our shoftim and our shotrim, and let's act like a responsible tzibur and go and deal with what needs to be dealt with over here. And Aaron doesn't do that. So now, of course you're going to be mad at me because I'm going to say Aaron did the wrong thing. And good. Because if you're mad at me, then you're wrong. because God thinks that he did the wrong thing. Moshe thinks he did the wrong thing. Moshe says, how did he do this? What did they do to you? How did you end up doing? And Aaron is trying to protect people. And yes, we understand Aaron, Oiv Shalom, Rodev Shalom, and Aaron is looking for a way of doing this in a peaceful manner. And, as I said a moment ago, look what happened to poor Jerry. She was a nice woman when she came here, and now she's been radicalized, and now she's
To be a
a little. So you're 1 second. You're saying I'm not being fair?
fair,
Uh,
has the benefit of hindsight.
Even better, even better, even better. So Pinchas could be there looking and asking the question, so what should Aaron have done in such a case? What should Aaron have done? And maybe he'd even still be alive today. By the way, because there are those who say, ultimately, come on. Ultimately, Aaron's real sin is really the Chet Egel. I know in terms of Pshat it's harder to say it, but there are those who say it anyway. And now I want to get back to the beginning of the Parsha, in source number 20. V'deber Hashem Moshe lemor Pinchas ben Elazar ben Aaron HaKohen. And what are we told about him? Vayeta lo zarach harav brit kunat olam tachat t'shur kinei l'lokav v'yichaper al b'nei Yisrael. He acted as a Kohen. How did he act as a Kohen? He stopped the Magefa. How did he stop the Magefa? He did exactly what it was that he was supposed to do, which anybody disturbed, then I apologize for everything. But what do you now realize? That this is also an incident of inheriting his position, which this is also an act of inheritance, which means that Pinchas, by going, and by the way, it's so much stronger. It's actually a tikkun. It's actually a tikkun for what Aaron did. Aaron, and I agree with you, that it's always harder the first time when faced with something, what do I do? And essentially you can end up feeling damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Or just as easily it could be, Moshe, come down and see all these dead people. What, Aaron, what did you do? I left you people to look after. What in the world happened over here? And there's been a massacre. On the other hand, now, gaining from the benefit of having seen how that didn't work out and looking at a scene unfold in front of you where God has already said there needs to be judgment, and therefore that Moshe element of, okay, go out and Mila Shemelai and it sounds like there's a hesitation. It sounds like they did not do what they needed to do, and somebody needs to step up and do something in order to, again, it's not just shock therapy, but it's going to stop what's happening, because it's going to show this forceful resistance. But most importantly, and I don't want you to miss that point, is it says, Vayichaper al b'nei Yisrael. If I have to ask the question, why does Pinchas become a Kohen? So you could just say it, because his father was a Kohen, his grandfather was a Kohen. But where does he prove his Kohen bona fides, as it were, Vayichaper al b'nei Yisrael? Because he brought about, and what did he do? He did the same thing that Aaron had done previously. He does the same thing that we had found Moshe does it sometimes, and that there's a plague going in the camp, and he stops it. How does he stop it? And this is, a little hard. He stops it by killing people. You say, but how can you do such a thing? Well, there was a previous episode, and that was a path not taken. And maybe the path not taken was the path that should have been taken. So over here, all that I'm showing you is that by Pinchas choosing to do, and this is the part which may be difficult, what Aaron should have done, he therefore properly inherits, as it were, or shows he is the deserving person to be called a grandson of Aaron, and in a certain sense does this tikkun for what Aaron should have done, and therefore we can now move further. Yes, I understand that I am with you and I'm radical and so on and so forth, but on the other hand, I also understand something else, and that is that we're reading the psukim over here, and as much as that, maybe some people reading it who want to attack him, the one who doesn't attack him is God. I mean, God seems to be approving, and that kind of takes you to a place, well, if God is approving, then maybe we should be as well. And I understand the danger of vigilantism, and I understand the danger of people taking law in their own hands. I understand the frightening thought of somebody taking a life. But on the other hand, Moshe is standing in the camp. Moshe just now reported what God had already said. These people then proceed to do an outrage, and staring in front of him, I believe, is that example that took place before, and that is the Chet Egel. And now the question is, what is the proper way to respond to this? And I think that's what Pinchas does. And if that's the case, then the entire parsha becomes one of inheritance.